Trump said tariffs would bring jobs home. Instead, they may be helping Canada find a way to live without America. That is the quiet, uncomfortable story unfolding right now along the world's longest undefended border. And it is not the story most people expected. For decades, the economic relationship between the United States and Canada was treated as a fixed law of nature. Roughly 3/4 of everything Canada sells to the world crosses that one border, into American ports, American warehouses, American shopping carts. It was assumed on both sides that this arrangement was permanent, too large, too integrated, too mutually beneficial to ever really break. Then came a series of tariff shocks that started in 2025 and, as of this week, have escalated again. And something unexpected began to happen. Canada did not collapse the way some predicted. It bent. It adapted. And in some corners of its economy, it began quietly rerouting itself toward a different kind of future, one less dependent on Washington than at any point in modern memory. This week, that story took another sharp turn. On Monday, President Donald Trump signed a fresh round of executive orders imposing a 50% tariff on a wide range of Canadian goods. Everything from packaging materials and textiles to horticultural products, electrical equipment, and, in one detail that made headlines around the world, honey and hockey sticks. The tariffs apply under the North American Free Trade Pact with no exemptions. The White House reached back to an obscure Depression-era trade law, Section 338(I), to justify the move, a legal tool so rarely used that most trade lawyers had to look it up. The new duties are expected to take effect around August 19th. On the surface, this looks like an escalation, and in political terms, it is. The Trump administration says Canada has unfairly discriminated against American autos, alcohol, and dairy products, citing the country's supply-managed dairy system, provincial restrictions on U.S. alcohol, and quotas protecting its own auto sector. The optics are being framed in Washington as a stand against a trading partner accused of stacking the deck against American producers. But look closer at the numbers, and a very different picture starts to emerge, one that complicates the narrative Washington is telling. Independent economists estimate the new tariffs will hit only around 5% of Canada's total exports to the United States. BMO senior economist Robert Kavchich put the value of affected goods at roughly $28 billion a year. He described that figure as digestible for the Canadian economy as a whole, even while acknowledging that specific industries and specific communities will be hit hard if the tariffs proceed as planned. Stephen Brown, chief North America economist at Capital Economics, went even further, calculating that the Section 338 tariffs will affect only about $20 billion worth of Canadian imports into the United States, a number he says is unlikely to move the needle much on the American side either. And Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney made a public statement outside his office in Ottawa the day after Trump's announcement. This is not, in scale, the sweeping across-the-board tariff regime Trump attempted earlier in his term, the kind the Supreme Court eventually struck down. It is narrower, more surgical, aimed at specific sectors rather than the entire trading relationship. And that distinction matters enormously for understanding what is actually happening to the Canadian economy right now. To understand why this week's announcement lands the way it does, you have to rewind the tape to early 2025, when Trump first returned to the White House and began reshaping American trade policy almost immediately. Broad tariffs were imposed on Canadian goods, framed at various points, as responses to border security concerns, fentanyl trafficking, and what the administration called unfair trade practices. Canada, for a time, responded in kind, imposing its own countermeasures on American imports. Trade talks between the two countries were halted, resumed, and halted again throughout the year, an on-again, off-again pattern that became almost a running feature of the relationship. Then, in February of this year, the legal foundation of Trump's tariff strategy cracked. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the president could not rely on emergency executive powers to impose many of the sweeping tariffs he had put in place, a decision that cleared the way for a significant portion of the 2025 measures to be unwound. Canada, in response, removed most of its own retaliatory tariffs on American goods. For a brief window, it looked as though the trade war might actually be cooling. It did not cool for long. Within days of the Supreme Court's ruling, Trump announced a new round of tariffs, 10% initially, then raised to 15% by the time they took effect in late February. Trade negotiations were suspended again in the autumn. And now, in July, comes this week's 50% measure under Section 338, a law so old it predates most of the trade architecture that governs North America today. What makes this pattern significant is not any single tariff announcement. It's the cumulative effect of an 18-month cycle of escalation, retreat, legal reversal, and renewed escalation. For a Canadian government trying to plan a national economic strategy, and for Canadian businesses trying to plan a supply chain, this is not a stable environment to build around. And that instability, more than any individual tariff rate, is what has driven Canada's response. Because here is the part of this story that has surprised even some seasoned economists. Rather than simply absorbing the damage and hoping for a better relationship down the road, Canada has spent the past year actively trying to build an economy that needs the United States less. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who came to office promising exactly this kind of realignment, has been unusually blunt about it. Speaking after his election victory in the spring, Carney declared that the old relationship Canada had with the United States, one built on deepening economic integration and tight security cooperation, was, in his words, over. He told the BBC in early May that Canada has a critical need to diversify its trade and its strategic alliances. That is not the language of a leader hoping to patch things up. It's the language of a leader trying to rewire the fundamentals. The numbers behind that ambition are enormous. Carney has set a target of doubling Canada's non-US trade over the next decade, moving from roughly $300 billion in trade with countries other than the United States to $600 billion. He has framed this as the end of what he calls a decades-long process of ever closer economic integration with its southern neighbor. It is, by any measure, one of the most ambitious economic repositioning efforts any G7 country has attempted in recent memory. And Carney has been putting his own travel schedule where his rhetoric is. In his first year in office, he logged 26 foreign trips, an extraordinary pace for the leader of a mid-sized economy. Just recently, his office announced a trip taking him to India, Australia, and Japan in successive stops. Mumbai first, for talks with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Indian business leaders, then Canberra, where he became the first Canadian Prime Minister in 20 years to address both houses of the Australian Parliament, followed by meetings with Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese on defence and artificial intelligence cooperation, and finally Tokyo for discussions with Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae on clean energy, critical minerals, and food security. Carney summed up the trip's purpose simply. In a more uncertain world, Canada is focused on what it can control, diversifying trade and attracting new investment. Perhaps the most consequential and most controversial piece of this strategy has been Canada's outreach to China. Ottawa recently concluded a trade agreement with Beijing, one described by analysts as good news for Western Canada in particular, opening faster diversification of agri-food, lumber, and energy exports into Asian markets. That deal drew unusually broad political support, with the premiers of British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan all backing it, despite what one commentator called well-founded concerns about the auto sector, sovereignty, and national security. It is a rare moment of provincial unity in a country where trade politics can be fiercely regional. But the China deal also triggered a direct reaction from Washington. Trump reportedly threatened a 100% tariff on Canadian goods, specifically over the proposed China agreement, intensifying the standoff between the two leaders. That threat is a reminder that Canada's diversification strategy is not happening in a vacuum. Every step it takes toward new partners carries the risk of provoking a harder line from its largest one. It's also worth noting where Carney chose to make some of his most pointed remarks. At the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year, Carney condemned economic coercion by large powers against smaller ones, remarks that received widespread praise and, according to observers, overshadowed Trump's own appearance at the same gathering. It was a small moment, but a telling one. A Canadian Prime Minister positioning his country as a voice for smaller economies navigating a world where trade has become a tool of pressure rather than simply commerce. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the data on how Canada's economy has actually performed through all of this is more nuanced and in some ways more encouraging for Ottawa than the tariff headlines alone would suggest. In 2025, the sectors directly targeted by American tariffs did suffer real damage. GDP in tariff-impacted industries fell by 4% for the year, with aluminum production contracting by 15.5% and motor vehicle body and trailer manufacturing shrinking by 11.5%. Canada was, in fact, the only G7 country to see its economy contract in the fourth quarter of last year, a fact that became a talking point for critics of the government's approach. These are not small numbers. They represent real job losses in specific communities, particularly in Ontario's auto corridor and in aluminum-producing regions of Quebec. And yet, look at what happened alongside that contraction. Employment actually grew by 4.4% in the fourth quarter, with meaningful gains in exactly the trade-exposed sectors you might expect to be hardest hit. Forestry, fishing, mining, oil and gas were up 2.2%, and manufacturing gained 0.8%. Canada's exports of goods and services actually rose 3.1% in that same quarter, building on growth from the prior quarter. That is not the profile of an economy in freefall. It's the profile of an economy absorbing a shock and finding new footing, sector by sector, even while the headline growth number looked ugly. RBC Economics summed up the broader picture bluntly in a recent note. Canada's economy has proven resilient through early 2026, bending rather than collapsing under significant headwinds. A second consecutive quarterly GDP decline earlier this year sparked genuine recession concerns, but RBC's economists argue that per capita growth data tells a more encouraging story, early-stage recovery, not outright contraction. To be clear, they add, the economy is not strong yet. Unemployment remains too high, population declines continue to limit the underlying growth rate, and sectors directly targeted by U.S. tariffs continue to underperform. The unemployment picture itself tells a story of gradual stabilization rather than crisis. The jobless rate peaked at 7% in the third quarter of last year, before easing slightly to 6.8% by year's end. It ticked back up to 6.9% by April of this year, as more people entered the labor force looking for work, which counterintuitively can actually be a sign of rising confidence rather than deepening distress, since it reflects more Canadians believing there are jobs worth searching for. And on the investment side, Canada's federal government has been keen to point to one statistic in particular. Canada continues to lead the G7 in per capita direct investment inflows, according to the government's own spring economic update, and businesses surveyed by Statistics Canada indicated plans to increase capital spending this year. The International Monetary Fund, in the same update, is cited as expecting Canada to post the second fastest growth rate in the G7 over 2026 and 2027. On jobs specifically, the government notes that Canada has added nearly 3 times as many jobs per capita as the United States since the start of 2025, 3.4 per thousand population compared to 1.2 per thousand in the USA, with the majority of that hiring coming from the private sector. Wage growth, meanwhile, has now outpaced inflation for more than 3 consecutive quarters. Now, a note of caution here, because this is where genuine debate exists among economists, and a responsible account of this story has to hold both sides in view. The Parliamentary Budget Officer's own June assessment strikes a more sober tone, estimating that trade policy uncertainty will reduce the level of Canada's GDP by 0.9% by 2030. Up from a previous estimate of 0.5%, and projecting that net exports will remain a persistent drag on growth throughout the coming years, as non-energy exports recover only gradually. The Bank of Canada, in its own analysis, has noted that exports were running roughly 4% lower than they were before trade restrictions were first imposed, and that tariffs continue to place upward pressure on inflation, only partially offset by lower global oil prices. Growth forecasts across major institutions cluster in a similar modest range. The OECD projects Canadian GDP growth strengthening to 1.2% in 2026 and 1.7% in 2027, as the economy recovers from what it calls the 2025 trade-related slowdown triggered by higher U.S. tariffs. TD Economics sees growth picking up from an anemic 0.7% pace in 2025 to 1.3% this year and 1.8% in 2027. The Bank of Canada's own outlook from earlier this year anticipated growth slowing to about 1.1% in 2026 as net exports weigh on the expansion, even as public spending helps cushion the blow. None of these numbers describe a booming economy. They describe a modest, gradual, uneven recovery, one still very much shaped by decisions made in Washington. There is also real regional variation worth understanding, because Canada's economy is really a patchwork of very different provincial stories. RBC expects Ontario's growth to slow sharply to 0.4% in 2026, down from 1.3% the year before, its slowest year on record outside of a severe recession, while British Columbia trails at 0.6%, squeezed by demographic shifts and continued tariff pressure on its lumber and aluminum exports. Atlantic Canada, by contrast, is holding up comparatively well, with Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia all outpacing the national growth average, buoyed by government spending and a recovering agri-food sector. The tariffs, in other words, are not landing evenly. Ontario's manufacturing base, the heart of Canada's auto industry, is absorbing far more pain than the fishing towns of the Maritimes. So where does this leave the diversification strategy itself? Is it actually working? Or is it more aspiration than reality? Here, credible voices land in genuinely different places, and it's worth hearing them out rather than picking a side. Statistics Canada data shows that roughly 75% of Canadian exports still go to the United States, even as Carney pursues new deals with Europe, a gap that has prompted sharp internal debate. Commentator Sean Speer argued pointedly that the Prime Minister's diplomatic energy is aimed at the wrong continent, suggesting Ottawa should instead redirect its efforts toward reinforcing the North American economic relationship that has underpinned Canadian prosperity for generations. The European Union, after all, still accounts for a meaningfully smaller share of Canadian exports than either the United States or the fast-growing Asia-Pacific region, a region where Chinese refining capacity in particular is positioned to absorb large volumes of Canadian crude oil. Trade policy experts Edward Alden and Inu Manek, writing for the Council on Foreign Relations, put the structural challenge in stark terms. About 88% of Canada's energy exports and 94% of its motor vehicle exports go to the United States, meaning Canada has genuinely limited options for rerouting that trade elsewhere in any short time frame. Their conclusion was measured but pointed. Quitting the United States, as they put it, is not likely to be easy for Carney or for Canadians. Even Carney himself appears to have absorbed some of that reality. Speaking at the Economic Club of New York in late May, he shifted his tone noticeably, pitching what he called a Fortress North America approach, telling assembled financial leaders that Canada remains open to deeper integration with the United States in specific sectors like aluminum, autos, and critical minerals. Trade analyst Dawson, cited in that same discussion, observed that most Asian and European firms have essentially accepted that the world has entered a period of protracted trade uncertainty, and are now factoring the cost of that uncertainty directly into their business decisions, which, if true, makes wooing new investment from those regions a slower and more expensive proposition than diversification advocates might hope. There is a middle ground reading here too, one worth taking seriously. A Brookings analysis this year framed the challenge less as a binary choice and more as a genuine strategic fork, noting that shifting trade volumes toward Asia or Europe requires port capacity, shipping arrangements, additional processing infrastructure, and critically, the political capacity to approve and build projects at a pace Canada has not always demonstrated. At the same time, the Brookings analysis noted that the United States remains the world's largest economy and a central node in global finance and technology, even as its domestic politics increasingly spill into trade and alliance management in ways that create real uncertainty for its partners. A dynamic other American allies, from Europe to Asia to Latin America, are all navigating in their own ways right now. There are also genuine bright spots emerging in the diversification data that are worth acknowledging. Canada's chief economist's own trade report notes that crude oil export volumes to Europe from Newfoundland and Labrador have increased, while the completion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion has opened new export capacity to Asia from Western Canada. And in a shift that gets far less attention than tariff headlines, Canada's services sector, everything from software to financial services to consulting, now accounts for nearly 1/4 of the country's total exports, a structural change in the economy that is less exposed to the kind of goods-based tariffs Washington keeps reaching for. Put all of that together, and a fuller picture starts to come into focus, one that is more textured than either Canada is thriving or Canada is collapsing. The tariffs have genuinely hurt specific sectors and specific provinces, particularly Ontario's auto industry and Quebec and BC's aluminum and lumber producers. They have added measurable drag to national growth projections and pushed inflation modestly higher. Analysts across the political spectrum, from the Bank of Canada to the Parliamentary Budget Officer to private bank economists, broadly agree on that much. But the tariffs have also done something Trump's administration likely did not intend. They have accelerated a strategic reckoning inside Canada that was probably overdue regardless. A recognition that concentrating 3/4 of a national economy's export activity in a single, increasingly unpredictable trading partner is itself a risk, tariffs or no tariffs. Carney's government has used that reckoning to justify an aggressive, expensive, and still largely unproven pivot toward Europe, Asia, and a controversial new relationship with China. Whether that pivot ultimately succeeds is genuinely an open question, and serious economists on both sides of it make credible arguments. Some, like Speer, believe the diversification push is chasing markets that will never replace American demand at scale. Others point to real measurable gains in employment, in exports, in per capita investment. As evidence, the strategy is already paying dividends, however partial. What is not in serious dispute is this. The old assumptions are that Canada's economic fate would simply track whatever Washington decided to do. No longer holds the way it once did. Carney has openly argued that the traditional U.S.-led, rules-based global trading system is fragmenting, and that smaller plurilateral agreements between select countries are becoming more viable than the old model of sweeping global trade deals. He has cast Canada explicitly as a bridge between the European Union and Pacific Rim economies. That is a bold repositioning for a country that spent most of the last century defining itself economically almost entirely in relation to its southern neighbor. Whether this latest 50% tariff proves to be a turning point or simply another chapter in an already long-running cycle of escalation and retreat is something only time will answer. What is already clear, though, is that the tariffs Trump imposed to reassert American economic leverage may be producing an unintended second effect, pushing Canada gradually and unevenly, but unmistakably, toward becoming a more independent economic actor than it has been in generations. Whether Ottawa ultimately gets the diversification math right, or whether geography and infrastructure quietly force Canada back toward the country it has always depended on most, remains to be seen. But the direction of travel for now is unmistakable. Canada is no longer simply reacting to American trade policy. It is trying, however imperfectly, to build a future that doesn't depend on it.